I'm Ralph Thomas, CEO of the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and I've been a CPA since 1982. And today, I'm one of thousands of Black professionals who have found success in work and life thanks to this coveted credential. But that success is in large part thanks to those who paved the way for Black accountants to ever become CPAs. Today, I'm joined by one of those early trailblazers, Dr. Ruth Coles Harris, who was number 83 in the first 100 Black CPAs. As you know, 2021 marks the 100th anniversary of John W. Cromwell Jr.'s landmark achievement of becoming the first Black CPA. And that was some years ago, to say the least. Dr. Harris, take us back to that time, what it was like growing up as a young Black person in Virginia, and what was the typical outlook for you then?
Well, I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was a pretty small city. And of course, it was in the era of segregation. So I went to the all Black schools. I had all Black teachers. I had all Black classmates. And we could not go to the public library. We couldn't go to most public facilities. Uh, so I grew up when you went downtown, you went to a department store, you saw two signs over the water fountains. One was black for blacks, and the other one was for whites. So just about everything was that way. When I went to college and we went to the Trailway bus station, they had one section for blacks and one section for whites. So just about everything was segregated as I grew up. And I had never heard of a CPA. There was no television, so I had no role models on television. I knew the only Black professionals I knew were dentists, physicians, and clergy and school teachers. So I had never seen an accountant. I never heard of an accountant. I didn't know what they did. And there were very few Black businesses in Charlottesville, and they were all in one little area called Vinegar Hill, which was later raised and a big hotel and a courthouse replaced all the Black businesses. But when I was a child, that's where they were located. So I grew up in a totally segregated society.
That's so interesting. So, who or what inspired you to pursue accounting? Because as I read the article that was in Disclosures back in the July August 2019 issue, it seemed like you were thinking about chemistry.
Oh, I was. I loved chemistry when I was in high school. So I was sure I was going to major in chemistry when I went to college. But there were a couple of reasons why I didn't. One was because when I got to college and I thought about registering, I knew that I did not like any of the other natural sciences except chemistry. I didn't like biology. I didn't like physics. And I said, why would I major in chemistry and have to take all those things I don't like? The other reason was my older sister was always my role model. So from early childhood, I always wanted to go where she went and did what she did. So she was just my role model. And she was 2 years ahead of me. And she had gone to Virginia State College for Negroes. That was the name of it. It had for Negroes on the end. And I went there. And she majored in business administration. So I said, well, maybe I should go over to the business administration table. And that's what I did, primarily because she had done it. And then when I got in my first accounting class, that's when I first heard about a CPA. My accounting professor told us about it. And I loved accounting. It was the only course that I could stay up all night and study. And then we were only required to take 1 year of accounting. But 6 of us decided we liked it so well, we would go ahead and take an elective in advanced accounting. And in those days, there was no intermediate accounting. You just went from elementary to advanced. So the 6 of us went to the advanced accounting class. And our professor was a graduate of New York University. And he told us that if we were interested in accounting as a career, we should strive to become CPAs. He said, whatever you do, you need to go to the top of your profession and get the best credentials that you can get, because someday the door of opportunity is going to open. And when the door of opportunity opens, you want to be ready to walk through. He said, you can't wait until the door opens and then start getting ready, because it's too late. So you need to start now. So my suggestion is that all of you go to graduate school. And he was promoting NYU because that's where he had been. And my sister had gone to NYU. So when I finished Virginia State, well, my sophomore year at Virginia State, they dropped her for Negroes. And I was happy because I didn't want that on my diploma. So when I graduated, I followed in my sister's footsteps and I went to NYU.
You went to predominantly Black institution for.
Not predominantly Black, all Black.
Okay, all Black. But share with us your experience when you went to NYU, which was predominantly white at the time, I'm sure, and some of the things that you encountered while you were at NYU.
Well, when I first went to NYU, I didn't know how I was going to be able to compete with people who had been to the most prestigious high schools. And they're going to be in the same classes that I was in. And I'd never been in a classroom with a white student or white teacher before. So that was my first experience. And I was afraid that, we had been told by some people that we were inferior, although our teachers always told us that we were as good as anybody. And in high school, our teachers told us that we had to be not just as good as, but we had to be better than. So we got that message from high school all the way through college. And I had some of the best teachers in the world in high school and college. I remember in college we had an English professor who used to invite us over to her house in the evening sometimes, and she would give us ham sandwiches and Coca-Colas, but she would always remind us that we were not there to eat, we were there to study. And she was excellent. I was in a section of the English course where we had to work harder than the students in the other sections. And we didn't think that was fair because we thought that students in other sections were getting A's and didn't have to work as hard for them as we did. And there was no such thing as a C in the section I was in, because if you did C work, then the professor just made you do the work over again until it was A or B. So you couldn't make a C. So when I got to NYU, I was really much better prepared than I thought I would be. And I found out that there were some people in my classes who were far less prepared than I was. And that made me feel really good. And that's when I began to appreciate the teachers who made us work so hard.
So it sounds like you had a fairly good experience at NYU, being that it was a majority white institution. Is that a fair statement?
Well, that is a fair statement. I was not treated any differently, except that I was in one management class, and it seemed that and they were all males except me. And it seemed that the students used to tell jokes during the class sessions. It was a 2-semester class. And the first semester I was in a 7:30 in the evening class, and it was late at night by the time I got back home. And the second semester, I was able to register for the early section. So when I got in that class, I was the only female in there. And the first day, somebody started to tell a joke. And the professor said, remember, we have a lady present, and that's not acceptable. And that kind of surprised me, but it was a good thing. And I don't remember of any other time that anything happened that made me think that there was any difference between me and the other students in the classes. And one thing that gave me some inspiration and some courage was that one of the fellows who was in my college accounting class was also at NYU, and we had a couple of classes together, and we sat side by side. So I felt like if he can do this, I can do this. So I really didn't feel any different. But one thing that made me feel really good was when I was writing my thesis, and my thesis instructor called me in, and he said, when you were in college, were you an English major? And I said, no, I was a business administration major. Why do you ask? And he said, because you're the only one of my advisees that didn't have to rewrite the because of English errors. And that's why I thought you were an English major. So he was surprised to know that I was a business administration major. But that was that English teacher that we thought was too hard, and the one who used to invite us to her house sometimes. So that's when I really began to appreciate how good my teachers were. Even though I thought they were pretty hard, I found out that they were really good.
So it sounds like you had a fairly good experience at NYU, um, in relationship to your experience at uh, the HBCU. Is that a fair statement, Dr. Harris?
And I had a really good experience both places.
Great. So in reading the article where and let me first stop and say congratulations on being the first recipient of the Ruth Coles Harris Advancing Diversity and Inclusion Award in there. That was really great to see in that issue of the Disclosures magazine. Um, so um, I would imagine now. Let's just take it now down. You finished NYU, and now you're deciding, what career path you want to take. And as it turns out, you ended up going back into education. And and share with us why you chose that pathway.
First of all, I hated New York City, and I knew I didn't want to live there. And my sister tried to get me to stay in New York and study with her and sit with her for the CPA exam there. And I said, no, I know I want to go back to Virginia. I really want to be a CPA. And I knew there were no opportunities in Virginia at that time, but I just couldn't bear to think about living in New York City anymore. I didn't like that year. I didn't like New York City the year I was there. I liked the school, but I didn't like the city. So I thought I would come back. I had no idea what I would do, but the Lord is good. I was blessed. The president of Virginia Union University sent me a telegram when I had almost finished my MBA. And he sent me a telegram and told me that he would be in New York City the following week and that I had been highly recommended for a teaching position at Virginia Union. And if I was interested, he would come by and interview me while he was there. Well, I didn't have anything else to do, and I had never thought about teaching on the college level. So I said, yes, I'm interested. And he came by and interviewed me and offered me a position, and I gladly accepted it. There were a couple reasons. Well, I guess there were three reasons why I was happy to accept it. One, because I didn't have anything else to do and it sounded like an interesting position. Two, when I went to Virginia State, and that was during the Second World War. And as soon as men were 18, they had to go into the service. Well, he turned out to be my husband, but at that time he was 17, so he came to college the same year I did. But at the end of our freshman year, he was drafted into the service. And when he came back, I was a senior, which meant that I graduated and he still had 2 more years. So coming back to Virginia and coming back to Richmond put me very close to Virginia State. And that meant I was closer to him. And then the third reason was I had a younger sister who was going to be a freshman at Virginia State that year. And that would put me close to her. And I used to go to visit her every weekend. And we used to exchange wardrobes, and people thought we had twice as many clothes as we did. But we were just exchanging each other's clothes. So there were 3 reasons why I came back.
So that's interesting. Did you ever think about going into public practice, or were opportunities for blacks in public practice available?
I wanted to go into public practice, but you had to have 2 years of experience in public accounting. And I knew there was no one who would give me 2 years of experience in public accounting. So I said, well, I have this opportunity to be a college professor, and I would do that and do that to the best of my ability. And someday the door of opportunity still might open, and I still might become a CPA. And if I couldn't become a CPA, I would do like my college professor did. I would encourage my students to become CPAs. So I guess I had been teaching a long time before the first doors of industry and business and government began to open up. And that was when I decided, well, in the meantime, my sister had passed the CPA exam in New York City. And she was the first Black female to pass the exam in the state of New York. So when opportunities for employment in business and industry began to open up in Virginia, I kept telling my students that they should try to become CPAs, but I was not willing to ask more of them than I was willing to ask of myself. So that's why I decided, even at that late date, that I should go ahead and try to pass the examination. So that's what I did because I wanted to be an inspiration to my students.
I can say that I'm certainly glad that you did choose that route, because you've done a phenomenal job as a faculty member and a teacher in accounting, well, from all the folks that I've talked to. I guess one thing that would, if you could share with us your experience in taking the CPA exam, because as I looked through the article that the Virginia Society uh, did on you, seems like you had some challenges in terms of taking the exam in the Virginia Beach area.
I did, but before I do that, could I tell you a little bit about how it was for my students?
Sure, absolutely.
There were a lot of negative things that my students ran into. Um, when the doors of opportunity did, as I say, open up, and recruiters began to come to Virginia Union. I remember one time I sent a group of students down to be interviewed by representatives of the Internal Revenue Service. And when the interviews were over, I would always sit down with the interviewers of the recruiters and ask them how the students did and, what were their weaknesses so that we could improve for the next time or for the next group of students. So I asked about the performance of my students, and I was shocked at the answer I got. They told me that all of the students that I sent were qualified, but they were all females, It just so happened that the females were the best in the class that year. And they could not hire females because they did not think that white women would want their husbands traveling with black women, and that auditors in the IRS had to do a lot of traveling. And I thought that was very insulting. But a lot of things like that happened. When I tried to get internships for my students, and I contacted the local there were big eight in those days. When I would contact the big eight firms and ask them about internship opportunities for my students, they would tell me that their Richmond offices were too small and they couldn't afford to hire any interns. And my colleagues over at VCU were telling me all along that their students were getting these opportunities as interns. So I knew that internships were available. They just weren't available to my students. And my students ended up, well, the national offices would try to place them. And my students would end up in places like California and Boston and New York City, places like that, far away from home. So they couldn't get opportunities locally. So they had a pretty difficult time, and it wasn't easy for the faculty members either. I remember one time, as a result of the AICPA committee membership, and I was asked to make certain contacts with the Virginia Society. So as a result of that, I went to a meeting. It was at the undergraduate school at the University of Virginia. It was a year when everybody was considering a new book that had come out, Horizons for a Profession, and it had to do with the curriculum for accounting majors at the undergraduate level. And when I read the book, I felt really good because the idea was that business students should take more liberal arts courses. Because in many schools, they were taking primarily the accounting courses, and they were not taking many liberal arts. I felt good because my students were already taking just about what was being proposed in the curriculum in that book. But each state had a meeting to discuss this book. And I went to the one for Virginia. And when I got there, people started calling me Ruth. And I'm wondering, how do they know my name? I don't know anybody here. It didn't take me long to discover they had a printed program and the names are on there. And I was the only one named with a female name. So they figured I was Ruth. They didn't think any of the men were named Ruth. It turned out there were 74 white males and me. So everything went along fine during the morning session. And at lunchtime, we were sitting at tables of about 8. And everybody was discussing this meeting that they were going to for all accounting faculty members in the state of Virginia. And I sat there and listened to this discussion, and I'd never heard of what they were talking about. And after they kept talking, finally I said, well, I've been a faculty member at a university in Virginia for 14 years, and I've never heard of this meeting. And everything got quiet. Nobody said anything. And finally, the Dean of the School of Business at UVA said, well, I will see that you get invited this year. And he did. And not only was I invited, but all of the HBCU faculty members were invited. From then on, we got invitations. And I kind of had the feeling that they didn't go out of their way to do anything to us. But as far as they were concerned, we just didn't exist. So if we didn't exist, naturally we weren't invited. But that also taught me that if you don't speak up for yourself, nobody else is going to speak up for you. So that was an experience that I had. And during that time, accounting was kind of um, a profession that was looked upon as a profession for men. You didn't find many women of any color. And I would go to AACSB meetings, and maybe there were 6 females there out of all of the people who were there. And maybe half of them were black and the other half were white. But there were just few females of any color in the accounting profession.
Well, we're so happy that you did speak up and did ask about that, because I'm sure it has made a difference in being having a position or a seat at the table, as you say, to hear what was going on at other institutions so that you could share that same information with your students as well. But I want to take back to when you set for the CPA exam, because in reading the article that was in the Virginia disclosures, I just thought that was such an interesting story. If you wouldn't mind, if you could just share that experience and what you had to go through to actually sit for the exam.
I'm going to tell you about that, but I do have to add that I ended up being a member of the board of directors of the Virginia Society of CPAs. So things did change. Now I'm going to tell you about my experience sitting for the CPA exam. Everybody who applied to sit for the exam, which was being given in Virginia Beach, Virginia, was sent a letter from the State Board of Accountancy. And one of the things that was enclosed in that letter was a list of places where you could stay. And you were asked to check the one that you wanted them to make a reservation for you. And when I looked at it, I was tempted to check something. But I knew in my heart that there was no way I could stay at any of those places in Virginia Beach at that time. And I was really going to Virginia Beach to try to pass the exam and not to fight a civil rights battle at that time. So after I read the letter 2 or 3 times, I decided I would call the office of the State Board of Accountancy and ask them, did they really mean that? So I made the call, and the person who answered the phone asked me to hold on while she passed the phone to somebody else. And after it was passed to 2 or 3 people and nobody had a response, they were all just quiet and said, let me pass you to somebody else. It so happened that the chairman of the State Board of Accountancy was in the office that day, and it finally got to him. So I explained to him that I wanted to know if I really should check something. Did they really have a place for me to stay at Virginia Beach? Because I knew that I didn't tell him, I knew that the hotels and motels there were close to blacks. So when I asked him, he said, unfortunately, I could not stay at any of those places, so I should not check any of them. And I said, well, do you know of another place that I can stay? And he said, no, I don't know of any place that you can stay. I said, can you help me find a place? He said, well, I'm afraid you're on your own. So I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I was determined to take that exam. So I asked everybody I knew if they knew of a place or they knew anybody who lived in Norfolk who might be able to tell me. And I finally found a place that I could stay. And I went there, but the only problem was I had to commute and nobody else did. So I just commuted to Virginia Beach to sit for the exam. And while I was there the first day, each member of the state board came by individually to apologize to me. And that was upsetting because I needed every minute of my time to concentrate on the exam, which was timed, of course. And I didn't really want to take time from my concentration on the exam to even accept their apology. But that made me determine not just to take the exam, but to pass the exam. I said, I've got to prove to these people that I can pass this exam. So I passed the exam. But I found out about it in a very non-traditional way. I was in my classroom one day and someone came in and called me and said, you need to come out and take this telephone call. Well, the first thought that went through my mind was something terrible must have happened to my husband or one of my children because nobody called you out of class to take a telephone call. So I went to my office and took the call. It was the person identified himself as a reporter for the Richmond News Leader. And he said, I just wanted to congratulate you on being the first Black female to pass the CPA exam. And I said, well, you know more than I know because nobody told me that I passed the exam. And he said, well, I was down at the State Board of Accountancy this morning and they told me. And I just wanted to write an article about you for the afternoon paper. And I couldn't be sure that that was a valid telephone call. So I went on back to class. I said, okay. I went on back to class. And when the class was over, I couldn't wait for afternoon to come so I could go downtown and buy a copy of the paper and make sure that that was really true, which I did. And I read the article. And after I read the article, then I went and told my the head of my department and the president that I had passed it, and they were all very happy for me. But most people found out they passed the exam by receiving a letter from the State Board of Accountancy. So I found out by taking a call from a newspaper reporter.
And I also understand from reading um, the Virginia magazine Disclosure, you went down to the office and they kind of talked to you and then said, "We'll come back in 30 minutes."
That's when I applied for my certificate. Well, after I passed the exam, I said, well, I still don't have a certificate. You know, I passed the exam, but I need to get my certificate. So I need to do my 2 years of accounting for a CPA firm. Well, by that time, my friend who had graduated from Virginia State with me and who had gone on to NYU with me was a professor at Virginia State University. It was Virginia State College then. And we were still close friends. And I knew that he had a small practice in Richmond. And I didn't know how he got his certificate. I never asked him. I didn't know who he worked for because I couldn't imagine any firm in this area hiring him. So I called him and I said, Curtis, I passed the exam, but I still need 2 years of experience. So I don't want any pay. I just want the experience. So could I come and work for you and just get the experience so I can apply for my certificate? And he said to me, well, you know, when I passed the exam, I applied for a certificate. And I knew that none of the firms were going to hire me. But the state board told me, I've forgotten how many years he had been teaching, but the state board told him to go back and teach another certain number of years and then reapply for his certificate. And he did that and he reapplied and they gave him a certificate. So he said, I think what they're doing is considering a certain number of years of teaching at the university level as equivalent to experience. So he said, you already taught beyond that number of years. So if I were you, he said, I'd be happy to have you come and work with me. But he said, if I were you, I would just immediately apply. So I did. And that's when I went for an interview with the state board. And they talked with me for a while. And then they told me to go get a cup of coffee while they decided whether they were going to give me a certificate. And I don't drink coffee, and I was nervous, so I just sat in the chair outside the door. I said, I'll just sit here until they call me. So they called me in and told me to have a seat at the head of the table. And I did. And then the first thing they said was, sign your name here like you wanted to appear on your certificate. And the only thing that came to my mind was Ruth Harris, and that's what I wrote, and I never wrote my middle name. I regretted that afterward, but I just wanted to get out of there. And I just wrote whatever came to my mind, so I didn't write my middle name. But I got the certificate.
It must have been interesting sitting there waiting for their decision. And I could imagine that, what was going through your mind as you sat there. Could you share did you think that you were going to get your certificate, or did you think that they were going to come up with some excuse why you couldn't get your certificate?
I really didn't know. I was just kind of thinking anything could happen. I was hoping for the best, but expecting maybe the worst. So I was hoping that I was going to get the certificate. And I was really happy when I did.
Well, I can imagine that. I know how happy I was when I passed the exam. I actually went home and told my parents, and I just my mom was just in tears, when she heard that I had finally passed the exam, because it took me a couple of sittings to get through it. So it was a long, long journey. So I can just imagine how you felt when you were sitting outside of the State Board of Accountancy office, wondering whether you were going to actually get your certificate and whatnot. Um, you've had a distinguished career in education. And first and foremost, I want to thank you for being in education, because without role models like yourself, who knows where the young people that you taught and mentored during your time uh, at the university, where they would have been without someone like you. Because I understand from reading in the magazine, also one of your students, who's now I think a partner at KPMG, said how inspired she was and having you as a teacher, because apparently you were a tough teacher in college. And she said, it was interesting, um, but she was just so inspired by the way you conducted yourself, the way you worked with your students, and putting them in a professional type atmosphere, for meetings and things of that nature. Um, so I just want to say I'm just so glad that you did stay in education, because I think who knows where those young people might be today without having somebody like you mentoring them.
Well, could I tell you that the student you're talking about is now a member of the Virginia State Board of Accountancy?
I'm not surprised.
I also want to tell you that I had the pleasure of teaching two of the first 100.
All right. So that didn't. Who were they?
Jerome Broadus in Maryland, and Robert Coles in Ohio.
Well, you really have had a distinguished career in terms of teaching some of a number of people who were part of the first 100 Black CPAs. I guess as we kind of wind down, the number of Black accountants and CPAs has grown over time, but even today, y- y- there is still inequity in terms of the numbers. And I guess, what are some of your hopes and concerns for the Black community when you see what is still happening today?
I've heard the expression, the more things change, the more they remain the same. So it kind of seems like we started out with a very low percentage. We've had a lot of breakthroughs, but we're ending up with almost the same percentages that we had before. So it says to me that we've done a lot of work. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. So we need more role models who can inspire another generation of students to become CPAs. The only difference is they probably have more opportunities than we had. So they need to be encouraged to take advantage of the opportunity. If we had it hard, we didn't have the opportunity. The opportunity is probably there more so now than it was then. So we need to encourage young people to go into the field and provide more role models for them.
So what would your advice be for Black accounting students and professionals trying to progress and make change in the profession and in our communities? What advice would you offer to them or suggestions to them?
So I must admit that I have not been active in the professional associations in those 24 years. And I'm not as up to date with what's going on as I should be. So I'm not sure that I can tell you what should be done now. I'm
Okay.
sure that I can say for the students, do the best that they can do every day. And always remember what my professor told me, that you cannot wait for the door of opportunity to open and then start preparing, but you have to be prepared so that when the door of opportunity opens, you can walk through it. I think that's still good advice. And as my husband used to tell me, he said, there are no obstacles, there are only opportunities. And so you should turn every obstacle into an opportunity. And I think that still goes. And as far as I was concerned, I said, if you hand me a lemon, I'm going to make lemonade.
And I think that is good advice. I know my parents used to say the same things when you in a situation and you make lemonade. Take the situation and if they're lemons, turn the lemons into lemonade, and things will be all right.
Right.
Well, I think we've talked a good bit. I guess one of the things I'd like to ask you is, so it's been 100 years since the first Black CPA. What's your vision for Black CPAs over the next 100 years? Do you have any thoughts of on terms of the vision for those coming along today?
Well, my vision is that we won't be talking about what we're talking about now as it relates to those people who are coming along. I'm hoping that there will be so many more minority CPAs that we won't be making a big distinction between them and other CPAs. They'll just be CPAs. That's my vision. I'm not sure that will happen, but that's my vision.
Well, it certainly has been a pleasure. Anything else you'd like to share with us?
No, thank you for the opportunity for this interview. I've enjoyed it. It's nice to see you again.
It's good to see you, and I want to thank you for sharing your stories with us because I think in this whole initiative, it's going to be very helpful for young people to hear about some of the stories, the things that the first 100 Black CPAs had to go through, and the pathway that you and others have blazed for them to become CPAs. So I want to thank you so very much for sharing your story. I'm sure your accomplishments and experiences will continue to inspire and motivate generations of Black CPAs. I know the time I've spent with you in AICPA committees, I've been inspired um, about the work that you've done as an educator. And I just want to thank you because I do believe what you've done is blazed the pathway for individuals like myself who've come behind you in terms of pursuing being a CPA. So, Dr. Harris, thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and thank you for all that you've done over the years for your students and for our folks of color and ethnicity?
Well, I was just doing what I thought I needed to do.
Well, you've done a remarkable job because you truly are a trailblazer in our profession. So thank you so very much.